During this webinar, I'll provide an overview of our organization. Jonathan Fisher, Research Advisor at Equitable Growth, will discuss our funding priorities, and Colleen Harwood, Grant Operations Manager, will go over how to apply and tips for a successful application. We have a lot of registrants, and so we'll be brief to offer plenty of time for questions. But first, a few housekeeping notes. As I'm sure you see, the event is being recorded and is on the record. The recording will be available on our YouTube page following the event. If you have a technical question or would like to add to the conversation, please use the chat box. We'll also be adding some helpful links in the chat box as we go. If you have a question for any of the presenters, please use the Q&A box. As I said, we do have a lot of registrants, so please be concise with your question and please include your first and last name as well as your institution when you submit the question. Okay, and now to get started. Can you start the slides? Excellent. All right, you can advance. So we are the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and we are a nonprofit research and grant-making organization dedicated to advancing evidence-backed ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and equitable growth. Okay, next slide. All right, as such, we have a unique funding approach. We describe it as a feedback loop between policy and research. We seek to fund research that will inform policy debates, both current and in the long run. And while we do seek to advance the academic literature, preference is given to applications that are informed by policy and are clear-eyed about the policy implications of the proposed research. Our work with policymakers informs the research questions we ask. So we hear from policymakers and we listen to the gaps that they're facing in the evidence needed and what evidence is needed to inform policy solutions. So, as I said, we are very interested in advancing academic literature, but we also are interested in research that is poised to inform policy. Okay, next slide. Alrighty, so we have two funding streams, academic and doctoral and postdoctoral. This webinar focuses on academic grants. That being said, we do encourage you to alert your graduate students who have relevant research to the doctoral and postdoctoral grant opportunity. Okay, next slide. All right, Equitable Growth awards just over $1 million a year in academic grants, and the average grant is about $60,000. Our grant program is designed to fund discrete research projects. It is not designed to support research agendas, university centers, or to consider renewal requests. While our grant program is relatively small, we do partner with a lot of other funders. We regularly share proposals that are not a good fit for our grant program or that require support beyond our means with those other funders. Okay, and now that's all for me. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Corinne. So just to introduce myself, I'm Jonathan Fisher. I'm an applied microeconomist and a former Equitable Growth grantee. I joined Equitable Growth about 2 months ago, and I am the research advisor. Part of my role is to help Equitable Growth to continue to expand its network of researchers and guide it in its grant making. And my own research touches on 3 of the 4 funding priority areas for Equitable Growth. The only one I don't touch on is market structure. What I suggest, we list these 4 funding priorities, and in RFP, we give more detail on the types of questions we're interested in and the issues we're interested in. And so you can see the full RFP for the types of questions and for the full detail of these 4 funding priorities. Next slide, please. And what I want you to get from this slide is we're not just for economists. Equitable Growth has typically funded mostly economists, or the majority have been proposals have been by economists, but we support research from different disciplines. In the past, we've supported sociologists, those in social work, political science, law, education, and public policy. And we're also interested in interdisciplinary research and research that speaks across the disciplines and cites across the disciplines. And it's also, we also support a variety of methodological approaches as well. It doesn't just have to be the typical quantitative work from economics. And so if your topic touches on inequality and its forms and its relationship to growth, we're interested in it regardless of discipline and your methodological approach. It's the topics we're interested in and the best projects. So the next slide, please. The last thing I want to mention is under the leadership of our new CEO and president, Michelle Holder, we're giving increased importance to the issue of racial stratification and how its role in inequality and growth. It's always been part of Equitable Growth's mission, but it's taken an increased role, for many reasons. What we suggest is that not all topics can directly touch upon the role of racial stratification in your research, but there may be indirect implications. And we suggest that your LOI and your proposal, if possible, can either speak to the indirect or direct role of racial stratification. You may be studying monetary policy and how it affects growth, and you may say, well, if this monetary policy affects the top of the distribution, leads to more growth at the top of the distribution, you can then say, well, you may not be able to speak directly to racial stratification, but you can say, well, if this policy increases growth at the top of the distribution, but not at the bottom, we know white households are overrepresented at the top of the distribution, and so this particular policy may exacerbate racial stratification and inequality by race. And so that's the way you can indirectly speak to racial stratification, even if your project can't speak to it directly. The last two things is, we want data. We encourage data where projects are creating new data, and the studies, as I mentioned earlier, that engage with the relevant literature across the disciplines. So now I'll turn it over to Colleen.
Hello, I'm Colleen Harwood, Grant Operations Manager. I'll be sharing details of the application process and tips for a successful application. The 2022 online application portal is now open, and the deadline to apply is Wednesday, January 26th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. The link to the online portal can be found within the RFP, and we will share the direct link through the webinar chat function now. For more details, an FAQ page, including eligibility criteria, an example of a successful LOI, and a suggested template for writing your LOI, please see our academic grants webpage, which we will also share in the chat now. All letters of inquiry will be evaluated on how well the proposed research questions are appropriately framed within the existing literature, the potential to advance the literature, and the methodological soundness, relevance to Equitable Growth's mission, and the potential to make a contribution to evidence-backed policy solutions will also be taken into consideration. As you prepare to submit your application, take the time to read through each section of the request for proposals, as well as the webpage shared earlier. Following these guidelines will help you understand if your research is a good fit for Equitable Growth and will help you draft a strong proposal for the review committee to consider. Letters of inquiry are brief by design to save applicants and review committee members time. You must be concise while also providing sufficient information for reviewers to evaluate the rigor and appropriateness of the research design. It is also important that your project be at the right stage for funding and that you share that information with the reviewers. Find the sweet spot. You need to have enough done to be convincing about your project, but still have new work to accomplish with the funding. When writing any funding request proposal, it is important to structure your writing in a way where the reviewer can quickly understand your goals and your plan to accomplish your goals. We have shared a suggested template that you can download and use to draft your letter of inquiry. Using the evaluation criteria as headers to organize your LOI will help you stick to the page limit while ensuring you provide all the information reviewers need to assess your proposal. A common mistake in unsuccessful proposals is lack of consistency when talking about your research question or research design. Be sure to proofread prior to submitting to help prevent that problem. The last tip I have for you before we turn to the Q&A is to be clear about your data sources and the status of data access. It is not a requirement to have access to the data your project needs at the time of submission, but it will definitely help us understand and assess your proposal if you state what types of data you will use and how you plan to access that data. This concludes the presentation portion of the webinar, and now we will move on to the Q&A. Thank you for submitting questions to the Q&A box, and if we do not get to your specific question today, please email us at grants@equitablegrowth.org. Now I will turn to the Q&A box, and the first question we have from Luis Quintero is, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what you have in mind with stratification. Is that referring to segregation in space or differences in income or both? I will pass that question to Jonathan.
Thanks for the question. It can refer to both, and so it where there are differences by race, it can be segregation, it can be income, it can be wealth, it can be for my own consumption, it can be differences by race. And so it doesn't, it can be, whatever sort of differences there may be across race, we're interested in.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have another question from Ernesto Castaneda. Is it possible to use the grants to gather original survey and qualitative data? Yes, that is definitely a use of our grant funds that is appropriate. We have another question from Luis Quintero. What types of activities can be funded? Research assistance, data purchases? I will say we have details on budget constraints on our webpage, but Corinne, do you want to go into more detail about what our allowable costs are?
Sure, and I'm actually going to fold Marina from the Center for Retirement Research. She's asking about indirect costs, so I'll answer both of these questions. Equitable Growth does not cover indirect costs. This is a policy that is applied across all of our funding without fail. We do recognize that sometimes this presents some constraints on the university side, but up to now, no university has declined our funding based on this, and in our experience is very used to this and willing to work with funders. And then we fund salary support, research assistance, if project support is needed, if you are, for example, running a survey, data purchase, the incentives for surveys, any costs directly associated with the conduct of the research or the personnel who is doing the research are all allowable costs. We do have caps on salary. We limit salary to $20,000 plus fringe over the course of one academic year. Exceptions will be considered for course buyouts. As Colleen said, you can find more information about budget guidelines on our website.
Thanks, Corinne. We have a question from Juliana Londino Velez. If we think our project might fit more than one research area, market structure, labor market, etc., where can we read more about the different areas? I will say that it is okay to apply under any of the headings, and we wouldn't constrain you due to which topic area you elect on your application form. But we are also open to one-on-one conversations with applicants prior to submitting, so we can talk more individually about where your project would best fit. We have another question from Priyanka Anand. How common is it for Equitable Growth grantees to receive another award for a new project? Is it an advantage or a disadvantage to be a current or former grantee? Corinne, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Hello, Priyanka. We absolutely consider, we have funded former grantees again. If you are the principal investigator on an open grant, meaning that you currently have a grant that you are working on with us, then you are not eligible to apply as a principal investigator for a new research project. You can apply as a co-principal investigator, or if you are a co-principal investigator on an open project, you can apply. But we definitely do not, we are objective. You do not get a benefit from being a former grantee. Your application is not giving special status, but we don't ding you for being a grantee either. We're really interested in funding the projects with the greatest potential. The one thing about being a current grantee or a former grantee with Equitable Growth is that we have a lot of grantee resources that never expire. So even if your grant term comes to an end, once a grantee, always a grantee in terms of accessing our resources. And Colleen, we have one question from Rena Conti that we missed that's about supporting book monographs. We haven't typically funded very many projects that are book projects, but they're not ineligible. So we certainly would consider supporting a monograph or a book project. We do not support the development of teaching materials, however. We are interested in either in articles or perhaps books. Sorry, we can move on.
Thank you, Corinne. We have a question from Darwin Deo from San Jose State University. He asks, is Equitable Growth interested in projects which focus on how indirect or institutional factors affect inequality as well as direct economic outcomes? Jonathan, do you want to take that one?
The answer is yes. It definitely would fall within our interest. So that it would definitely fall within our interest.
Great. Now we have a question from Julia Sizik. She is wondering about the scale of proposed projects, particularly for qualitative research. She says, since many of your grantees are quantitative, I was wondering if you also consider qualitative, smaller scale research like interviews and participant observation as methods for conducting research, or if you prefer larger scale survey methods.
I can take that. Yes, absolutely. So part of all applications go through internal and external review, and part of the review process would be assessing whether or not we think there's saturation with any of the surveys. So we have absolutely funded qualitative surveys that have a sample size of maybe 25 or 50 folks for in-person or either focus groups or in-depth interviews. But similarly, we've funded larger scale surveys with thousands, with sample size in the thousands. So either is fine, but we absolutely don't draw a line and say that small sample size is not of interest. Again, it's just that the methods and the sample would have to align with the research goals of the project.
Thank you, Corinne. We have a question earlier about whether software costs are supported, and yes, that would be an eligible cost. Next, we have a question from Ezgi Kurt from Bentley University. Can you tell the differences between the LOI and the full proposal that comes at the second stage in May? And I can speak to that. Yes, we have a two-pronged application process to lower the barrier of entry into our grant program. So we receive many letters of inquiry, and then after a review process, we narrow things down to invite a smaller portion to submit full proposals. And that full proposal will be a longer submission, and we will be able to provide more information to our review committees to properly assess whether your proposal warrants funding from us. Corinne, do you have anything to add on that?
No, again, I think I would just point them to the academic grant webpage, which has more information on what is required in the letter of inquiry versus what's required in the full proposal.
Great. Next, we have a question from Paula Cole. She says, in the criteria, you shared 2 points about the importance of advancing the literature, but then mentioned prioritizing policy advancement. Policy reports are often different from academic literature. Can you speak more to what you mean by literature?
That's a good question. And maybe Jonathan will want to tag on to my response. So as I mentioned before with the question about do we support books, the main goal of Equitable Growth's grant program is to support academic research. So our expectation is that the results of an academic grant are going to be academic articles for submission to journals and presentation at academic conferences. So that's what we mean by advancing the academic literature. That said, we really hope that people take current policy context and debates into consideration, and we're not averse to supporting. We haven't done to it's. I'll just say we're not averse to supporting research projects whose end paper is a policy report. Although that's rare, we do focus more. So it's more sort of about how you're framing your questions and an awareness of the current policy debate that's important, as opposed to the product itself. I hope that answers the question. You can.
And what I'll add on, Corinne, is that there's a lot of, as a former grantee, what I didn't see is all the work that Equitable Growth then does to take your academic research, and will do, and put it in front of policymakers. And so then it may be we put it as a working paper, and then a more policy focused web piece. So we're taking the academic literature and putting it before the policymakers. And so I think that's the a piece that I missed when I was first a grantee.
Thank you. Our next question is from Soo Young Lee. They ask, if a research project does not include the aspects of racial stratification, would you consider it not suitable for the funding?
The answer is no. It doesn't have to touch on racial stratification. Just there are some topics that don't. We understand that, but it is something that we're interested in. Focused on racial stratification. If you can speak to it, we want you to, but we understand that not all can speak to it.
Emma Zhang asks, is it more difficult to be funded if the project is about health or secondary data analysis? Corinne, do you want to take that one?
I think I can answer the health, and I might kick it to Jonathan on secondary data analysis. We are interested in economic outcomes, particularly economic growth. Again, we recognize that not all projects' findings are going to be directly relevant to equitable growth or just economic growth. But our main outcomes of interest are growth and economic outcomes as opposed to health.
And on the primary or versus secondary data, you do not have to do your own data analysis. If you're using publicly available data, available through the Census Bureau of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that's fine. If you're collecting your own data, or using some other form of data, some proprietary data, it's all acceptable.
Thank you. The next question is from Christina Gibson Davis. She asks, if we have submitted a similar LOI to another organization like the Russell Sage Foundation, but do not know if that LOI will be funded, does that hurt our application chances? I would say definitely not. It's very common to submit funding applications to more than one organization. It is helpful when applicants let us know what other possible funding opportunities they may have, but it definitely does not hurt someone's application chances with us. The next question is from Paige Kelly at Cornell University. If the project would be using proprietary data, would the center support purchasing that data, even if the data would not be publicly available? Yes, definitely. That is totally fine. We understand that is the nature of some data. Another question from Luis Quintero. Is there any position regarding COVID-19 related research, either in favor or against? I'll pass that to Corinne.
So I guess I'm going to have to just guess at what you mean by COVID-19. So in terms of just the effects of the pandemic and the recession and current factors like current economic factors that have been caused or a result of the pandemic, we are mainly interested in those projects that will have some bearing or will give us some insight into future recessions. So we're not as interested in economic research that's looking at something that's really specific to the pandemic. But insofar as we can learn lessons for the future, that would be of interest. There's a bit more detail, not much, but a bit more detail in the RFP if you go in and look too, particularly in the macroeconomics and inequality funding channel.
Thank you, Corinne. We have a question from Amzin Izteveva, sorry if I mispronounced that, from University of Minnesota. Can you say more about the sweet spot between having done enough but still having more to do? And how does that apply to PhD candidates who are done with data collection? I'll also pass that to Corinne.
Sure. So I'm going to take the PhD piece of that question out for the moment and just say, when foundations are reviewing grant applications, we're very aware that we're always taking a risk. I don't have to tell a room full of academics that sometimes your research projects don't work out. And so as a funder, we want to make sure that that enough work has been done to assure that the project is likely to be successful. And so, if you have any preliminary results, if you just want to run some analysis on a small subset of your data, or perhaps you run some analysis on some publicly available data in the hopes that you will then have a different data set that is larger or can answer more questions. Anything that you can do to prove that you've thought through the project and that it has a likelihood of success. That being said, if you've finished the data analysis and all you really need to do is present the paper and get feedback and revise it, then you don't have it's hard to convince a funder that you really need the financial support to do those final steps. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the sweet spot. In terms of a PhD candidate, if you're done with data collection, but you still have a lot of analysis to do, particularly if that analysis is going to require research assistance or perhaps buying out of teaching duties, then that would be fine. We would consider that.
Great, thank you, Corinne. The last question we have time for today is, for academic grants, is there an advantage to applying as an early career scholar, or would it be better for my more senior co-author to be the PI?
We consider the full research team. So in terms of who is actually the specific principal investigator, I don't think it matters too much. And I think we will we share the slides, Colleen?
Yes, we will be able to share the slides after the event is over. We can transition now to close out. And again, we will be able to answer more questions via email. So if we didn't get to your question, we can get to you later on.
I think there is maybe just one more, just to Kate Bronfenbrenner. I'm sorry, we don't have any flexibility with our deadlines, but feel free to reach out via email. Maybe we can talk a little bit more offline. We are so sorry. Am I closing out now? I snuck one question in under the wire there. So Colleen, if you want to go back just one slide, I just want to highlight for everybody that there is a link to a form here. You can find it on our website as well, directly in the request for proposals. It's a form to fill out if you have more questions, specifically if you want a little bit more time to ask a question that's specifically about your research project and whether or not it's a good fit. You can fill out this form to request office hours, and the form will prompt you to give us some information. And Colleen and I will figure out who on staff is best to meet with you to answer your questions. So we're trying to be as available as possible for folks to answer any questions you may have prior to submitting. So please go ahead and take advantage of that if you'd like. And I just want to say thanks to everybody for joining. I hope that this was helpful, and you can always reach out to us via email or via this form to request more information. And please go ahead and share this request for proposals with students and colleagues. And we look forward to answering your questions and hopefully reviewing your applications.